now that I'm done with the donation pitch, I am really excited to introduce Christina Dierkes. She's one of our newer organizing committee members. Christina is the content strategist for The Ohio State University's College of Arts and Sciences, where she leads storytelling efforts. As a science writer and communications professional, Christina has worked in both industry and academic settings throughout her career. Christina has more than a decade of experience in running public webinars, and today she's going to tell us all about launching webinars to share science, giving tips on how to find a niche for your series and set it up for success. Christina, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. Let's get the screen share thing out of the way, maybe. I am also going to turn off my camera because it's always distracting. But there's the PowerPoint. And hopefully you are seeing a presentation.
Yes,
Does it look like
it is now on presentation mode. You've got it.
Excellent. All right. We're going to talk about building a public webinar series for your research. I always mention that I focus on public webinars. If you want to get your researchers to talk to each other, I'm maybe not the best person to ask about that. But most of us have cool research that's going on that we would like the public to know more about. Maybe you're taxpayer funded, maybe you just want more eyeballs on what you're doing. This is me, this is my email address. If you decide after this that you're going to run your own research webinar series, I do want to know all about it because that would be really cool. So why do I get to talk about this? Like Allison said, I've been running webinar series for quite a long time. I started in my previous position with Ohio Sea Grant with a webinar series called Global Change, Local Impact. That was very focused on climate change impacts in Ohio and the Great Lakes region. We ended that series in about 2015 with a whole bunch of webinars, a whole bunch of email subscribers. We were part of dearly departed iTunes U and reached quite a few people with that. In 2022, we started another series called Freshwater Science that was focused on Ohio Sea Grant research and initiatives that we supported. And that just brought, science and related issues to the Great Lakes public. When I left Sea Grant at the end of last year, we had done 12 webinars. We had built, almost 1,000 subscribers into our email list from zero. We started that from scratch. So generally speaking, these were really successful webinar series. Freshwater Science is still happening. So I do have some experience talking about this stuff. How do you start a webinar series? The first question you're going to ask yourself is, what are you actually going to talk about? A lot of times when I have these conversations, I want to talk about climate change. Well, there's a lot of people talking about climate change. What's your particular niche within that setting? You want something specific like climate change impacts in the Great Lakes. You also want something that's going to be relevant to your public audience. If I tell somebody who's never heard of Ohio Sea Grant that we're going to talk about Ohio Sea Grant research, that's not helpful to them. But if I talk about Lake Erie science and clean drinking water, that's the kind of thing that's going to get audience interest. So what's your particular thing within the field you want to talk about? The next thing you want to talk about is, who are your speakers? Again, we're assuming that these speakers are going to be talking to the public. And I think we've all met researchers who are really good at that and researchers who are just not the right fit maybe for that particular audience. You also want to make sure that the people you're inviting are okay with talking to the public. Maybe they're not interested in that. So being really clear about who you're inviting and whether they're a good fit is going to be an important conversation every time you schedule a new speaker. How do you find those speakers? We all know our researchers. We've all figured out who is good at doing an interview and who needs some more help. Your staff, if you work with researchers who are really good at talking to the public, ask them if they know other people who would be a good fit for your series. If somebody randomly suggests a name, Google if they've given previous talks. A lot of places have done TEDx conferences. I've always pulled up YouTube with speakers that I don't know well myself. And then if you're open to speakers from outside of your organization, check in with their communication staff. The number of times that I've gone to other Great Lakes Sea Grant programs and said, hey, I need a speaker about climate change in the Great Lakes. Do you have someone? They were always happy to help. So use those connections, and that's a good way to get the speakers that are going to work for you and for your audience. Your next decision is what's the schedule that you're going to be on. You want something regular, once every quarter is probably not going to get you a lot of audience recognition. Weekly is a lot of work. That's almost a full-time job if you're doing it right. So monthly has been the thing that has worked for us. People can fit that into their schedules, but more than that tends to interfere with work. We were always big fans of sort of that lunchtime, midweek timeframe. That worked for our audience. Sometimes it's easier to do it in the late afternoon because people can just kind of finish their work early. That's maybe something to experiment with and switch back and forth until you've figured that out. If you're talking about people across multiple time zones, obviously picking that time is a little bit more difficult, but pick what you think the majority of your audience is going to be okay with. Obviously, for Ohio Sea Grant, that was people in Ohio, that was US Eastern time zone. We did get some international attendees who made time for us. We also got people who never attended in person, but were very active on the archives. So you just kind of do the best that you can for the majority of your audience. We've done both hour-long and half-hour-long webinars. The half-hour tended to go over a little bit. We decided we were okay with that. Again, just depends on your time commitment, your speaker time commitment. It's another thing that I can kind of go either way on. The last thing I would say is once you're ready to do a series, before you launch your first webinar, make sure that you're scheduled at least like a month or two out from there. The majority of your audience is going to come from the previous webinar. We're going to talk about how to capture them, but the majority of them are going to come from, oh, I saw this, I liked it, I'm going to sign up for the next one. So making sure that opportunity is there is going to be really important. And then your last consideration before you really get started is, where does the series live? You want something where you can post an archive as well as your upcoming webinars. And you want to make sure that that URL is consistent overall. You want one thing for your series, because if you get someone enjoying your March webinar and then they're not really into April, May, and June, maybe in July they think, hey, what happened to that series? And you want them to kind of remember the URL that they were coming from. Whether you do that with a static page or an event series or tags on your website really kind of depends on your particular setup. I've done everything from dedicated URLs and big build pages to just, we tagged everything and we had a way of pulling every event that was tagged with that tag. But you want that one reasonably short, consistent URL for your series to make sure that people remember it. Once you've figured out all of those pieces, you're kind of set to start doing the thing. This is where I'm going to take a quick break and drink some water and ask Allison if there are any questions up to now.
All right, let's see, folks, if you have any questions, you can feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you. You can drop a question in the chat and I will read it. Or just unmute yourself and start talking. We're a small enough group that I think we can manage that too. I will get us started. I kind of want to know, where you think this is most applicable when it comes to the sciences. Is this something that you would direct more to? You're talking about climate change, so it's kind of more of a hard science, but could this work in other areas? Could you attract an audience that way?
I absolutely think so. It comes back to, what is your niche? What do you want to talk about? It could be a sociology series on particular issues that are happening in your community. Do you have someone who can talk about, a domestic violence problem in a particular neighborhood, and then the next month you can talk about, access to healthcare in another neighborhood, things like that would lend themselves just as well to this. If you're coming from an arts background, what are the experts that you have access to? Do you talk about Italian art through the centuries? 1 month is 15th century Italian art, the next month is 16th century. And then you have, your next kind of season of your series goes to France instead, or to South America. So there's lots of opportunities to do this in just about any kind of research or creative activity that you can think of.
I like that. That's encouraging. Okay, we have a question in the chat from Mary. Mary is asking, do you collect demographic info on your registrants? And if so, what do you do with that info? That is a good question.
That is a good question. A lot of the registration information that we were collecting at the time was based on reporting to NOAA, which at the time was our funder and our kind of parent organization. So a lot of that was about, where in the Great Lakes are you from? Or, are you from not a Great Lakes state? We had people from India show up. We had a lot of people from Canada show up. Sometimes we would talk about, not with these series, but with other webinars we did, if they're coming from a particular industry. So our aquaculture extension specialist would be like, are you a natural resource manager? Are you a fish farmer? Are you from a tourism background? Things like that. We never actually looked into those traditional demographics, male, female, and, those kinds of things. I would always caution people to only collect the information that you actually need and want to do something with. I think we've all filled out surveys that are like, why are you asking me about my 5th grade, favorite subject? You don't need that to have me apply to a job. So you can build your registration any way you want to, and I'm going to talk a little bit about particular pieces that I've found useful, but just be kind of cautious about collecting data that you're not super into.
Okay. I have another question here from Dawn. And I like this one because I want to do the same, but she's asking where your webinars are archived so we can check them out later.
So I will actually share the PowerPoint with you guys as a PDF afterwards. And there's 2 links in there. They're both, they live on the Ohio Sea Grant website. They're also on YouTube. We do playlists. I find YouTube to be useful mostly as an archive, but maybe you're using it more as a social media platform. This is good content to put on there. But yeah, we do YouTube videos that are then linked to that particular webinar homepage so people can find them. But those links are in this presentation because yes, I want you guys to check these out.
This is great. The questions are coming in. And if you think we should go back to the webinar and hold any of these, let me know. But if you'd like, I can keep asking.
Let's do, where are we at? Let's do 2 more questions and then do the rest at the end.
Perfect, because I have 2 more. Okay, so Mark asked, how many of your participants were researchers and how many were members of the public? How might this translate to a group like, say, our group?
Yeah, so it really depended on the topic for us. We had certain topics that always were going to be more like natural resource managers, researchers, those kinds of people. But we have had everything from a 5th grade class. Their science teacher would bring them in and they would watch the presentation and they would send the best questions. We had 7th graders who asked better questions than any of the researchers that were on those webinars. So it really depends on kind of what advertising you have access to. Whether you prep your researchers the right way, your speakers the right way to make sure that those 7th graders aren't going to be like, I have no idea what's happening. But you have potential for any of those. It really depends on your marketing and your audience outreach.
All right. And we have a question from Mary, which is, what does success look like for each webinar?
Yeah. One of the big things that we always talked about was when you do a registration for a webinar, if you get about half the people who signed up to actually show, you're doing really well. And that happened for us most of the time. Every once in a while, we would unknowingly schedule against like another big Great Lakes event, and people would be like, but I have to go talk to, the governor of my province or whatever. And it's like, okay, you can watch the recording. Sorry about that. So that was always a big one for us. The other one for me was always that email list growth, because that was a good way of figuring out if we were reaching new people, new audiences. So if, again, we'll go into the registration a little bit in a minute. If new people said they wanted to sign up for our specific email list, that meant we did a good webinar, and they aren't, running away after they've seen one of them. They want to see more of them.
I like that. And that's encouraging, as I think we have more than half of our registrants in this webinar right now, which makes me very happy. And we are recording.
You're doing good.
Yay. All right. All right. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
I will keep talking, and then we can do more questions after. So you have a webinar series. You're ready to do the thing. How do you get people to attend the thing? Most of us have access to so many options, and the way that you use these is very much going to depend on what you have access to, what you're allowed to do from your organization. But some things to think about: social media, you want to do some kind of social media. Always remember to tag your speakers in those. I like using Twitter for it. But Facebook and Instagram are also options here. Tag their affiliation. So if their department has a Twitter account or their university has a Twitter account, tag those people. Often they would also then share those tweets, and it's some easy use of somebody else's list. Newsletters and listservs, you may maintain some of these. Most of us probably have a monthly newsletter or a weekly newsletter. Obviously, you want to use those. But also think about, what does your larger organization have available? I am based at Ohio State University. We do a daily email to staff and faculty, a weekly email to the students. I always submitted things to those newsletters. Again, the department that your speaker is coming from, or related departments that may be interested in your topic, see if they will share that information. Calendars, obviously your website calendar, but then the Great Lakes have a lot of regional groups and regional calendars, so I would always submit to those. Work with your speakers and with their departments. Maybe they have a communicator, maybe they have other opportunities to reach out more to their larger community. There's lots of those opportunities to leverage the people. And then the thing we're going to talk about next is building that dedicated email list, which is nice to have, but also provides a really good metric for growth. So the first thing we thought about, because with freshwater science, we were starting from scratch, who do we have access to? What can we pull together into an email list that may be relevant to audiences we're already talking to? With Ohio Sea Grant, that meant we had sort of a customer relationship management system that was subdivided into everything from charter captains who are interested in fishing and those related topics, to natural resource managers, to government officials, to some alumni groups. Take advantage of those particular relationships you've already built and offer them this particular piece of your programming as another thing you can provide for them. Professional organizations, maybe there's a list you can buy. We never did that because there wasn't quite one that was a really good fit for us, but depending on the webinar topic that you're working with, there may be professional organizations that are interested in being included in those emails. Always kind of emphasize the relevant existing lists, especially maybe with your leadership. You don't want to end up spamming people. So for freshwater science, as we were building an audience, we really went through the communities that we have access to and specifically selected a couple of communities for each month's webinar topic. So it was never, oh, you were on the last month's list, therefore you're getting it for this month. It was always very specifically built to appeal to that particular audience. So just think about who you're sending emails to. Nobody likes spam. Include an email sign up in your registration form. As people are giving you their information to get Zoom information, make sure that they have an opportunity to sign up for more webinar lists. We also asked people if they wanted to get our monthly newsletter. A lot of people did, so it was a nice way of kind of getting some other information out there too. Also, if you have some kind of sign up form for a newsletter, it might be a good idea to add a checkbox for your webinar series. That was another thing that really helped us kind of grow that audience while we were doing other things as well. You want to make sure that you kind of prep your speaker in advance of the actual webinar. Practice sessions does not mean that they sit there and go through their entire 20-minute presentation. It just means that they log into the platform, they attempt to share a PowerPoint or whatever it is they're going to be sharing. And you just make sure that a random Zoom update doesn't suddenly delay your webinar by 20 minutes. We've all been there, I'm sure. Especially with external speakers, Ohio State put some security measures in place where suddenly our University of Toledo speaker couldn't turn on his video, and I had no idea why, but we were in a practice session and not our actual webinar. Once you have them on and they can share their presentation, you want to make sure that you kind of walk them through the agenda, re-emphasize how long the entire webinar is. We had some people be confused with the half-hour format because usually webinars are a full hour, so they had to go back and shorten their presentation quite significantly. So just run through everything with them again. If there are, post-event things you want them to do, like answering additional questions in writing, this is a great time to make sure they're okay with that without having, 80 people hear them say no to you. Answer any questions they have, obviously, and then we always share the registration list. And our registration included an opportunity for people to submit questions in advance. Sometimes the speakers would address those in their presentations, make adjustments. Sometimes it was just for us to kind of seed the Q&A at the end with those questions, so people understood that they were in fact allowed to ask questions. But practice sessions, if somebody asks you if you can skip those, I really, really would not do that. And then it's the day of your webinar. A couple of things to kind of keep in mind. We always sent out a reminder to both the people who registered, just so that was on top of their email inbox, and to our panelists, again, just so it was on top of their email inbox. Most platforms will give you the opportunity to do that with 2 buttons. The registrant email was always a mail merge out of Word, but just something the day of that says, hey, you signed up for this thing, you want to show up for it. Sign in early. Practice sessions are great, but Zoom updates all the time. So just to get anything out of the way, we always ask people to be on about 15 minutes early if they could do that. For chat, I highly recommend locking down any kind of way that your registrants can share information with each other. We've had people, I come from a climate change webinar background. We've had people come in that seem to be sponsored by the petroleum lobby, who were just like, climate change is not real. You can set your chat to let participants only chat with the host and panelist. You can make sure that you can still send them messages, but make sure that those questions aren't visible to everybody, because that just causes all kinds of problems. Your organization may have requirements for automated closed captions. They're always nice to enable. It's just a good thing to do. Don't forget to record. It's always a scary moment when you're like, did I hit that button? As you're introducing yourself and your speakers, throw in a quick Zoom overview. You know, hey, we're asking questions via the chat today. If you're not seeing that, here's the button to push to find that chat. We will be asking questions at the end in a moderated Q&A, just so people kind of know what to expect and know that they will have an opportunity to ask. And then while your speaker is giving their presentation, it can be nice to just kind of put some reminders in that chat that go to everybody that say, you know, we're recording this, here's where that recording is going to be posted. Towards the end of your webinar, put in a survey link if you want to survey people. We always did for reporting, but it's also just nice to know that you're providing a thing that is helpful to people. And then this is where having the next webinar scheduled comes in. Put in the registration for the next webinar. If you liked this event, here's another one next month. We always got like 40, 50 people who just clicked that button and we're set for next month. So it's a good way of having your audience on the hook and keeping them there. And then you're done, right? No, obviously you're not. Is it ever that easy? There's a couple of follow-up tasks that I would either recommend or that actually may be required by your organization, but things like sending a thank you email to everybody who registered, even if they didn't attend. Put the survey in there, put the archive link there, and put the next webinar registration in there. You have all of their emails. Make sure they get that touch point and that opportunity to interact with your content more. If you had additional questions and your speaker agreed to answer those in writing, you want to make sure that those end up on the archive website. With the recording, I don't know how it is for a lot of other platforms, but our Zoom deletes recordings after a certain amount of time. So we will pull the file, put it into YouTube, and then we are actually required to go through a captioning service. It can't just be YouTube captions for accessibility reasons. So just make sure all of that is in place and taken care of. Any kind of reporting that you have to do it now. Don't do it at the end of the reporting year when you're desperately trying to track down your registration list. And then if you asked people if they wanted to sign up for your email list in any way, shape, or form, make sure you update that list before you send out the next announcement for your next webinar. And then you're done. And you have a webinar series in place. So that was, I know, a lot of information, but I'm going to attempt to stop sharing and turn my video back on. And do we have other questions? Are there other things we can talk about?
Yeah, folks, if you want to unmute and ask your question, you're welcome to do that. Raise your hand and I can call on you, or tried and true, type it into our chat, which is open for everybody to see the questions. This is a good lesson that we should maybe keep in mind in the future. Thank you, Christina.
We're a good small group, but again, if you have 150 to like 400 people and you're talking about climate change, there's just some people in there that it gets scary sometimes.
Christina, what are some of the main things that go wrong? Like, it seems like just starting out, giving your first webinar, if you haven't handled the technology, there'd be a lot to navigate, and it seems like a trial by fire. So how did you kind of jump in and learn all this and get up to speed?
A lot of it is honestly just jumping in and figuring it out. One of the reasons I put this presentation together initially was because hopefully this way, other people can learn from the mistakes that we made. You know, I've run webinars where the chat was open and there wasn't an opportunity to close it. And it's like, okay, we dealt with it this time, but let's not do that next time. So now that you've heard it from me, that is a mistake that you're not going to have to make in your webinar series. But I think the big thing that comes with this is also have more than one person running your webinar. For us, it was always the speaker, me in the background, and then my boss doing kind of the moderation and the Q&A. So you have someone who is focusing on the content, someone who is focusing on kind of the speaker interaction and the hosting, and you have someone who can, you know, type, oh, here's how you turn on your sound on and off for the 17th time into a private chat. So having that extra backup is kind of essential to running these things smoothly. But at a certain point, I think it's also just about realizing that technology is weird and people are now a lot kinder about those errors. I think, you know, if we've taken one pandemic trauma away from this, it's that technology is weird. So people are generally very patient. There's always one or two, but when you're building that audience and you have, you know, 400 people in a webinar and one is grumpy about it, like, okay, you're always going to have that one person.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mark, I think I see you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
Oh, yeah. You know, I'm constantly trying to relate this back to our group and our attempts to sort of build. One thing I was wondering about, I think I know some of the answer seems obvious, but you know, the first thing that popped out of me was just the size of your audiences, which was, you know, such an aspirational thing for a group like ours. So the one thing I was wondering about, I figured, well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that this was, you know, you're generating these webinars out of a big institution with a lot of built-in contacts, but some of it may also have to do with the nature of the subject matter. Can you kind of parse that a little bit? I mean, how, you know, how for a group like ours that's still fledgling and doesn't have, you know, that we don't operate as an arm of a big institution right now, what's the best way to start to build toward those bigger audiences?
Yeah, if you saw in the presentation, it's specific and it's relevant. Those are the two things as you're picking your niche that you really need to consider. And the, you know, climate change, this was in 2010 through 2015. Climate change was the topic. We found a very particular niche for us, and I had nothing to do with that. I came on after that was set. But we found something that gave us a big audience. The Great Lakes is a big area, but it was specific enough that nobody else was doing it. And that was just it was lucky. And it was, you know, we had that opportunity because we were thinking about that kind of climate communications piece just in a little bit earlier than other people. So it was a little bit of that. We also were just able to kind of leverage those informal connections, you know. Ohio Sea Grant at Ohio State is a little bit weird because we're part of it, but we're not really part of it. And we have a NOAA parent and we have a state parent. So there was a little bit of that of support, but a lot of it was just taking advantage of the things that Ohio State offered us, those newsletters, those academic departments. A lot of our speakers were researchers from OSU. So really being kind of like, I am offering a thing that is useful to people, and I am offering a thing that is useful to your audience. You should want to share it with others. So really just that, making those connections and taking advantage of those connections was a big part of that growth. And, you know, for us, we're a smaller group, but we do all have those connections as well. It's just going to be a little bit more piecemeal than me taking advantage of, you know, the hundreds of thousands of people that are connected to Ohio State in some form. We ended up with things in the alumni magazine. They went on our website or got, you know, a newsletter and were like, can we share this with our alumni? And I'm like, oh no, that would be terrible. How dare you? You know, so those kinds of things, just talking to people and sharing your information and sharing those resources in whatever scale is always going to be the thing that helps you grow whatever it is you're doing.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question they would like to ask?
I don't have a question, but I want to thank Christina and Allison for putting this together. Lauren is here. Lauren Roars is on the call as well. She's not on the camera because she's got a sore throat, but we're both on the same team at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Equity, and Lauren runs our Health Equity Jam sessions, and I wanted her to be on this call, so that's why I invited her on here, and I appreciate you allowing us city folk to join you. I actually feel much more connected to this group than I do to the DC science writers, which I don't really have. I've interacted with for years, but not really gotten a whole lot out of, unfortunately.
Come here, join
Yeah.
us.
Yeah,
We like having
Part of us.
people.
We count your area as the Appalachians.
yes.
We're
That's
very,
right.
very
Baltimore
liberal.
is in the foothills of the Appalachians,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, it's great to have you. And one thing I might throw in is, you know, when we talked a while back in a different session, especially after Christina and Dawn and some others joined us, that we may end up, you know, we have to still work on this, but we may end up being able to develop into the first truly multi-state science communicators group. I mean, not the first one, but one that, you know, with this focus, we can theoretically have quite a large spread. And I think the more we can get people hopping in from either the broad Appalachian area or from other institutions that are just interested, that's going to be great for us. And so I really appreciate you being here.
Well, I just appreciate the fact that there are university connected people and PIOs in this group, and it isn't so focused on journalists. Maybe that sounds a little mean, but I mean, I think it should be, science writing groups like this should be for everybody. And I think I met Christina at the University Research Magazine Association. I think that's where we initially connected. Yep. So, and that's when I was at Hopkins before, and then I left, and now I'm back at Hopkins.
Yeah, I just, you know, on that point, does that mean, for instance, that your impression of DC science writers is that it was pretty journalist heavy?
Very much so.
I mean, you know, that's the area I come out of, but you know, I certainly think this is great. And by the time we got our group started, I think that ball game had changed so much that, I mean, there aren't that many science journalists left to even join any group.
Well, they're all in DC.
Yeah, or, you know, maybe some of the other metro areas like the
New York City,
California and New York. Yes. But, you know, I think the industry is now dominated by people with university affiliations. And so that just makes a lot of sense to me.
That's where we get back into finding your niche. Like maybe this is our niche, you know, it's providing that service to PIOs who are just not in that journalism setting most of the time. Obviously, we all have good conversations with those colleagues, but there's also just things that are not applicable to those groups. And I think this kind of presentation is one of them, but there's a lot of opportunities to really help out those science writers who are just in a slightly different field.
Yeah, absolutely.
AppSciComm has so much potential. This is so cool. Thank you guys all for having that conversation here. I did actually want to ask another question. If anybody else has any specific questions, please chime in or put them in the chat. We can read through them. But I did want to know about kind of the cost of something like this. Like if I were to say, suggest this at my workplace and, you know, I don't have this built-in audience, it's something new to launch, what kind of startup costs should I be expecting?
Yeah, the vast majority is going to be staff time. And that's really just because you're going to be doing all of the work. But we used Zoom through the university account, so we didn't have any Zoom kinds of costs. We had a website that was already set up. Adding additional information to it wasn't going to be an additional cost. The biggest chunk of money, like actual literal money, was captioning. We paid about, I think it was about $100 per hour, kind of as an average, to a captioning service because we had that accessibility requirement. YouTube does really good captions, usually. Science is hard, accents is hard. We kind of had both of those going on all the time. So the captioning service was just the better solution anyways, but it was also a university requirement. And then MailChimp account to send out your emails. So kind of depending on what access you have there, it might be an additional cost to like get a share of an enterprise account. But we never paid speakers. We always had people come in who volunteered their time for us. And obviously we always profusely thanked them for it. We shared registration lists if that was a thing they needed for, grant applications. If they had an outreach component, we were an outreach component and we could show that that was the case. So it's kind of figuring out those particular exchanges more so than cost. But I think those are kind of the basic ones. So it really depends on what you have access to, but staff time is going to be your kind of biggest outlay.
Thank you. All right. And I see in the chat, Mary is a recommendation.
Yeah.
For transcripts. Good to know.
And those were, the captioning service really was one of those where Ohio State said, if you're putting this on an Ohio State site, this is what you need to do. So there's lots of good services out there. If you're at an organization that's not quite as stringent about that.
Okay. And I'm surprised. I had never actually realized that Zoom doesn't have this auto built in. We use Teams through my work a lot, and that it can happen automatically. So that's
Zoom will do like captions, but it's another thing where you have to go back, especially if your speaker maybe has an accent or you're talking about topics that aren't quite as common. I think Zoom uses otter.ai if you've used that for interviewing in the past. It really just depends on what you're using and what your organization says. Your accessibility office is going to be hopefully a big help with just telling you what you have to do.
Got it.
I have to say that I used that cockatoo recently, and I interviewed somebody with a very heavy German accent, and it was astonishing how well it did in terms of the transcript.
That's really good. Zoom is not great with Russian accents, I found out recently. So it's really just you're kind of figuring out your tool of choice.
Got it. Does anybody else have a question? I'll give you just a sec here. Put it in the chat, raise your hand.
I do want to mention I did put the slides in the chat. You should be able to download those. If you're having trouble with them, please email me. Get in touch. I am very Googleable. It's not a common name. The fonts in that presentation are kind of wonky. I think I need to download some things, but it has all the words in it.
I plan to print it out and kind of use it as a checklist. You told us a little about this before, but this just really has my ideas.
Good.
So thank you. I am going to I'm going to put, this is our website for anybody who might not be aware. Visit it, love it. It's wonderful. And actually, I am going to kind of take a tip from your presentation here. So first, thank you so much for the time you took today to share your knowledge with us, Christina. We really appreciate it. And before you go, everyone else, I wanted to let you know, see, I'm telling you about our next presentation. We have our next virtual event scheduled. Mark your calendars for 3 p.m. Tuesday, April 11th, and we will send a notification pretty soon through our mailing list and Facebook. But AppSciComm organizing member and co-founder Ken Chiachia, who is a science writer at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center and is on this call right now, will introduce us to Dr. Simon DeDeo, who is a scientist at, I hope I pronounced that right, at Carnegie Mellon University, and he's exploring how human culture and practices evolve. So his team used the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center's Bridges 2 system to show how their cultural landscape approach can explain how some religions persist, others change, and others die out. And they ran like I think 400, several hundred through this. If you aren't signed up with Apps.com, you can visit our website, which I did put in the chat, and you can fill in your name and your email in the contact section. That's all we ask for, your name and your email. We just want to be able to get in touch with you. No other demographics are required at this time. And we'll be sharing details about this event, like I said. And if you would like to get more involved with Apps.com, let us know. We are very open and we love to get fresh ideas from folks who join us. With that, I will say thank you again to Christina, and thank you to those of us who joined. This was really wonderful, and we'll get it posted so you can share the recording with your friends who might not have been able to make it. Thank you all.